I was 75 years old when my son looked me in the eye and said the words I never imagined I would hear from the child I once held against my chest on sleepless nights. His voice was sharp, impatient, nothing like the boy who used to run to me with scraped knees and tear-stained cheeks. "Mom," he said, glancing toward his wife for approval. "Either obey her rules or leave." For a moment, I thought I had misheard him. Maybe age had begun to play tricks on my ears. But the coldness on his face told me everything was painfully real. His wife, standing behind him with her arms crossed, wore a smirk so small most people would have missed it, but I had lived long enough to know the difference between polite confidence and quiet satisfaction. She had finally gotten what she wanted. I had been living with them for 2 years, ever since my arthritis worsened, and moving around the house became difficult. I never asked to stay. They insisted. My son said, "Mom, you took care of me all your life. Let me take care of you now." Those were his words. Beautiful, warm words. If only they had been true. The first few months were peaceful enough. But slowly, his wife began creating small rules. How I should fold the towels, when I should eat, where I was allowed to sit. "It keeps things organized," she would say. Then those rules became criticisms. Then the criticisms became orders. My son stayed silent through it all, as if ignoring the problem meant it didn't exist. I tried to endure it. I reminded myself that I was a guest, that they had opened their home to me. I convinced myself that I was overreacting, that I shouldn't be so sensitive at my age. But disrespect has a way of growing, especially when no one stops it. The final breaking point came one evening when I came into the kitchen and overheard them whispering, not quietly enough. "She needs to stop interfering," his wife snapped. "Your mother is old, but she's not helpless. She just pretends." My son sighed. "I know. I'll handle it." Handle it. As if caring for the woman who raised him was a problem that needed to be solved. That night, they sat me down in the living room like I was a child who had misbehaved. His wife did most of the talking, explaining her house rules, in a tone dripping with condescension. My son nodded along, refusing to meet my eyes. When she finished, he finally spoke. "Mom, it's simple. Obey her rules or leave." It was heartbreak, not pride, that made me smile. A soft, tired smile. The kind you give when you finally accept something you've been denying for far too long. I looked at the two people standing in front of me, one overflowing with resentment, the other hollowed out by influence he could not see. Without a word, I stood up from the sofa. My old leather bag, the one that had traveled with me through decades, was already packed. Somewhere deep down, I think I always knew this moment would come. People change. Sometimes for the better, sometimes for the worse. I walked past them, my steps slow but steady. They didn't stop me. They didn't ask where I would go. They didn't even say goodbye. I opened the door and stepped into the cool evening air, closing their chapter of my life behind me with the soft click of the latch. At 75, I thought I had seen every kind of pain a heart could bear. But betrayal from your own child, that is a wound no mother should ever have to feel. The night I walked away from my son's house, I had nowhere specific to go, but I wasn't afraid. I had survived far worse storms in my 75 years. Loss, poverty, loneliness, and moments where the world seemed determined to break me. Compared to those memories, the chill of the evening air felt almost gentle. My old friend, Margaret, lived only a few streets away. We had known each other since our early 20s, when we were both newly married and learning how to build lives from scratch. When she opened her door and saw me standing there with a single bag in my hand, she didn't ask questions. She simply stepped aside and said, "Come in, dear." Her kindness felt like a warm blanket around my bruised heart. Inside her guest room, surrounded by quiet and familiarity, I finally allowed myself to breathe. The silence was comforting, not heavy, not judgmental, just peaceful. For the first time in months, I slept without waking to the sound of footsteps, voices, or tension humming through the walls. The next morning, I woke early as I always had. My bones ached, but my spirit felt lighter than it had in years. Margaret made tea, and we talked about old memories, decades of shared birthdays, small triumphs, and tragedies we had carried side by side. She listened in silence as I finally explained what had happened. Not with anger, but with sadness. He doesn't realize what he's done, she said softly. No. Iraplia. And maybe he never will. I spent the next few days helping around her house, watering plants, knitting a bit, taking slow walks along the quiet street. With every passing hour, it felt like I was rediscovering a part of myself I had forgotten. I wasn't a burden. I wasn't helpless. I wasn't a prisoner of someone else's rules. I was still me, and I still had value. A week after I left, everything changed. I was in the living room, folding a blanket, when Margaret came in holding the telephone. It's for you, she said. A lawyer. I frowned. I hadn't spoken to a lawyer in years. My hands trembled slightly as I pressed the receiver to my ear. The man on the other end introduced himself politely and asked if I could come to his office for a meeting regarding a trust. A trust? I repeated. There must be a mistake. No mistake, ma'am, he said. It concerns your late husband's estate. My heart paused. My husband had passed away over 15 years ago. We had lived a simple life together, not wealthy, not extravagant. Or so I believed. That afternoon, Margaret insisted on accompanying me. The lawyer's office smelled of polished wood and old books. He greeted me warmly and placed a stack of documents on his desk. Your husband created a trust fund before he passed, he explained. It was meant to be activated if you ever faced hardship, especially involving family. Hardship. Family. How perfectly those words captured my situation. I listened, stunned, as he explained that my husband had quietly purchased several properties in my name, including the very house my son and daughter-in-law were living in. He had wanted to ensure that I always had security, no matter how life changed. Tears gathered in my eyes, but they weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of realization. Realization that someone had loved me deeply, quietly, and thoughtfully. The lawyer pushed one document toward me. You have full ownership, he said. And full control. Full control. Over the house they thought they owned. Over the roof they believed was theirs. Over the life they had built on a foundation they didn't even know belonged to me. For the first time since my son's betrayal, I felt something stir inside me. Not anger, but a calm, steady power. A strength I had buried under years of compromise and patience. I didn't say a word. I didn't need to. I simply folded the documents, placed them in my bag, and walked out of the office with my head held higher than it had been in a long, long time. Because now I knew something they didn't. And life was about to teach them a lesson they'd never forget. For a few days, I kept the truth folded neatly inside my bag, tucked between old handkerchiefs and photographs of a life long gone. I did not rush, and I did not celebrate. Patience had always been my greatest strength. One my son had forgotten I possessed. The first sign of trouble arrived quietly. I was sitting by Margaret's kitchen window, sipping tea, when she handed me her phone. They've been calling, she whispered. Several times. I took the phone and pressed it to my ear. My son's voice came through, breathless and irritated. Mom, why aren't you answering your home number? Something's wrong with the mail. We're getting notices, tax adjustments, mortgage changes. It doesn't make sense. Home number. He still called it home, unaware of the irony. I kept my voice calm. You should look closely at the names on those documents. What? Why? He asked, but before he could say more, I ended the call. I had no desire to explain what was coming. Over the next week, the world around my son and his wife slowly began to collapse, like a tower with rotten foundations. First came the tax warnings. Then the legal letters about overdue property assessments. Then a notice stating that the business his wife managed, one partially funded by my late husband's investments, was under review due to several financial inconsistencies. I had not orchestrated these things. I had simply allowed the truth to rise to the surface. People think betrayal is loud, a slammed door, a shouted argument. But the real kind, the deepest kind, is quiet. It happens in whispers, in neglect, in the absence of kindness. And when it returns just as silently. One afternoon, Margaret showed me something on her phone. A message from a neighbor who lived across from my son's house. They've been arguing for days, the message said. Screaming loud enough to wake the street. I think something's wrong. Of course something was wrong. Their perfect world, built on entitlement, arrogance, and a belief that I had nowhere else to go, was cracking open. The neighbors who once admired their confidence began to whisper behind closed doors. People noticed the late-night arguments, the frantic phone calls, the stack of letters piling up on their porch. They noticed the daughter-in-law's forced smile and my son's hunched shoulders. Reputation is a fragile thing. It can take years to build and minutes to shatter. A few days later, my son called again. This time his voice wasn't irritated, it was panicked. "Mom, we need to talk," he said. "Something's happening with the house. The ownership records, they don't make sense." "They make perfect sense," I replied quietly. He hesitated. "What does that mean?" "It means," I said gently, "that your father prepared for things you never imagined." The silence on the line stretched long and heavy. I heard his breathing, uneven, uncertain. For the first time in years, he sounded like a boy again, lost and overwhelmed. But this time, it wasn't my job to save him. That evening, Margaret and I sat in her living room watching the sunset bleed into the sky. She looked at me with a small smile. "You're handling this with remarkable grace." I shook my head. "I don't want to hurt them. I just want the truth to be seen." "And it is," she replied, more clearly than ever. Rumors spread in town, not because of anything I said but because people observe naturally. They connected the dots. They remembered how abruptly I had left. They noticed how quickly my son's life began to fall apart afterward. Sympathy does not always belong to the strongest, nor to the loudest. Sometimes, it belongs to the quiet old woman who left with a single bag, and did not look back. And though my heart still ached for the boy I once raised, I could not deny the small, bittersweet satisfaction blooming within me. Life has a way of correcting itself. They had pushed me out of their home. Now life was pushing them out of the illusion they had built. The knock on Margaret's door came on a gray, cloud-heavy morning. I was in the living room, knitting a scarf I had started years ago, but never finished. The moment I heard the knock, sharp, urgent, almost desperate, I knew exactly who it was. Margaret opened the door, and there stood my son and his wife. They didn't look like the confident, polished couple I had once lived with. Their clothes were wrinkled, their eyes swollen from lack of sleep, and the pride they wore like armor was nowhere to be found. Instead, they stood on the porch looking frightened and small. "Mom," my son said, his voice dry, as if the word scraped his throat on the way out. We need to talk." I set my knitting aside and nodded for them to come in. They hesitated, as if unsure whether they deserved to step across the threshold. Slowly, they walked inside and sat down on the edge of the couch, leaving a respectful distance between us. His wife spoke first. Her voice trembled. "We didn't know. We had no idea about the trust. Or the house. Or the business investments." She swallowed hard, her hands clenched together. "We thought everything was secure." I listened quietly, my hands folded in my lap. Silence is powerful when used wisely. I had learned long ago that people reveal their truest selves in the spaces where they expect you to speak. My son leaned forward. "Mom, please. We're losing everything. The house, the business, our accounts, everything is unraveling." He paused, struggling for breath. "And we can't fix it. We don't know how." For a moment, I searched his eyes, the same eyes that had once looked up at me with innocence and trust. Now they were filled with fear and regret. Not anger. Not resentment. Regret. "I know you're the only one who can stop this," he continued. "The lawyer said so. The documents, they're in your name." His wife nodded, tears gathering at the edges of her eyes. "We're sorry," she whispered. "For everything. We were wrong." The apology, though late, was not empty. It carried all the weight of a collapsing world. I took a slow breath and let it out. "I don't want to destroy your lives," I said gently. "I never did." They both looked up, startled by the softness in my tone. "But," I continued, "I also cannot forget what happened. You asked me to obey or leave. You made me feel like a guest in a home that was legally mine. You treated my presence as a burden instead of a blessing." My son blinked rapidly, shame darkening his expression. "I wasn't cruel. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't remind them of every disrespectful moment. Life had already done that for me. I will sign the documents needed to stabilize things, I said finally. Relief washed over their faces like a tidal wave. But, I added, holding up a hand before they could thank me, there is one condition. Their bodies tensed. You must move out of the house, I said calmly. It belongs to me, and I want my remaining years to be peaceful. His wife gasped softly. My son lowered his head, defeated, but neither argued. They understood now, powerfully, painfully, that actions have consequences. That the elderly woman they dismissed as fragile had a backbone stronger than steel. I stood and walked to the window, watching the clouds shift slowly across the sky. You will rebuild, I said softly. You are young. You have time. But I want a home where I am respected. My son rose to his feet. His voice cracked. Mom, I'm so sorry. I closed my eyes for a moment. The apology touched me more deeply than he knew. You will do better, I replied. You must. They left quietly, without anger, without pride, only humility and acceptance. 2 weeks later, I moved back into my house. The rooms felt familiar and foreign all at once. I walked through each hallway slowly, touching the walls as if greeting an old friend I had lost and found again. For the first time in a long time, I felt truly home. My revenge had never been about ruining them. The world took care of that on its own. My revenge was reclaiming my dignity, my peace, and the life I had built with my own hands. And sometimes, silence is the loudest justice of all.